Good morning. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in for the live stream of this event, and thanks to everyone who will watch video of this event at a later date at a time of your convenience. I'm Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Amid security concerns and the need to reignite growth, countries are ramping up industrial policies to support innovation in specific sectors. A new Fiscal Monitor chapter from the International Monetary Fund shows that industrial policies are not a magic cure for slow growth. According to the IMF's report, a well-designed mix of fiscal policies to promote innovation more broadly and facilitate technology diffusion across countries and firms can deliver faster productivity growth. To discuss and debate the report's findings, I'm pleased to have authors of the report here with us today. Let me introduce our speakers. Daniel Garcia-Macia is an economist in the Fiscal Affairs Division at the IMF. Prior to joining the IMF, he held posts at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and at the European Central Bank. Li Liu is a senior economist in the Fiscal Affairs Division at the IMF. Prior to joining the fund, she was a senior research fellow at Oxford University. Panelists that will discuss the report: Chiara Criscuolo is principal economist at the International Finance Corporation. Prior to joining the IFC, she was the head of the Productivity and Business Dynamics Division at the OECD. Reka Juhasz is an assistant professor of economics at the University of British Columbia. She is the co-founder of the Industrial Policy Group and previously held academic posts at Columbia University and Princeton University. Dabla-Norris is the deputy director of the Fiscal Affairs Division at the IMF. Since joining the IMF, she has worked on a range of advanced, emerging market, and low-income countries and published widely on a variety of topics. She was previously mission chief to Vietnam for the IMF. The run of show of this event will be very straightforward. We'll have a presentation of the Fiscal Monitor chapter, and then following the presentation, our panelists will offer comments on the chapter. The authors will have the opportunity then to respond to those comments, and then we will have a discussion among us. Audience members are welcome to submit questions to john.toohey@aei.org. You can find the spelling of John's email address on the webpage for this event. And so with that, I will turn it over to the chapter authors to present their research.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. So let us get the slides up. Great. So thanks everyone for attending this presentation of the April 2024 Fiscal Monitor chapter on expanding frontiers, fiscal policies for innovation and technology diffusion. Li and I will be presenting today, but this is the work of a big team from the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department listed here. This chapter focuses on how fiscal policies can help to lift the pace of innovation and broaden its gains across countries and firms. This is relevant at a time when innovation and TFP growth have been falling and medium-term growth prospects are diminished. Moreover, innovation is not diffusing fast enough, and gaps across countries remain large. At the same time, fiscal space is shrinking in many parts of the world. Motivated by the need to reignite productivity, as well as other goals like security considerations, governments have ramped up the use of industrial policies, as you can see in the chart on the left, produced by Professor Juhasz and her co-authors. A common element of these policies is that they try to support innovation in specific sectors, like green or high tech. This approach has raised concerns, including its high fiscal cost. So how should governments use fiscal policy to promote innovation and diffusion at a time of high debt and limited fiscal space? The chapter focuses on this question. First, when should governments direct innovation support to specific sectors using industrial policy, and how? Second, what are the most cost-effective fiscal instruments to promote innovation for countries at the technology frontier? And third, how can fiscal policies facilitate technology diffusion to countries below the technology frontier? To answer the first question, we extend a model of endogenous innovation with a sectoral network calibrated with data on cross-sector patent citations. The results suggest that industrial policy for innovation is only beneficial if the following conditions are met. First, the government can clearly identify the sectoral externalities it wants to target. Second, subsidies are provided to sectors with high domestic knowledge spillovers. Third, government capacity is strong enough to prevent misallocation, for example, to politically connected sectors. And fourth, policies do not discriminate against foreign firms, which can be self-defeating as other countries can retaliate, and all countries, even large advanced economies, rely on innovation by foreign firms. The chart on the right shows that a large economy with a benevolent government can benefit from subsidizing more sectors that generate higher research spillovers to other sectors. However, these gains can easily turn into losses if government capacity is weaker, so moving to the right, or for small open economies that depend more on foreign innovation in the gray line. That said, given the need to decarbonize economies, allocating subsidies to innovation in low carbon technologies can make industrial policy more beneficial, as shown in the dashed line. The chapter also reviews historical experience with industrial policies for innovation. And one takeaway is that industrial policy is prone to policy mistakes. Even when projects succeed in transforming industries, which is not always the case, they often entail high fiscal costs and, in some cases, negative cross-border spillovers. Let me turn it to Li.
Thanks, Daniel. So for countries at the technology frontier, using the right tools to promote innovation more broadly with an emphasis on fundamental research can provide more growth and fiscal dividends. This table compares the increase in total R&D tax expenditure per dollar of fiscal cost for each instrument and examines design features. These estimates are based both on existing literature as well as new estimates that compare various policies in a single setup. Both sets of estimates point to certain tools being more cost-effective, which we highlight in green. However, policy design is crucial. Grants are most useful if targeted to earlier stages of the innovation life cycle, for example, while tax incentives must be easy to access if they are to benefit more than just the large established firms. And while governments have been shifting towards supporting firms' R&D instead of doing public R&D themselves, we emphasize that public R&D is necessary for fundamental research and can crowd in private R&D. For a complementary mix of the most effective tools, we estimate that increasing spending on these policies by 0.5 percentage point of GDP, or about 50% of the current level in OECD economies, can raise GDP by up to 2% for the average advanced economy, and even reduce the debt to GDP ratio over the long term. Priorities differ for less technological advanced economy. Since homegrown innovation can be costly, these countries can obtain larger productivity dividends with policies that promote the diffusion of technologies developed elsewhere. Our analysis show that investing in human capital and digital and physical infrastructure is particularly important for them to reap the full benefits of technology inflows. For instance, the right chart shows that increasing education spending by 1 percentage point of GDP can help emerging markets and developing economies adopt technology faster, boosting their GDP by 1.9% over the medium term. Given more limited fiscal space in many emerging markets and developing economies, strengthening tax policy and administration, including eliminating ineffective tax incentives, can both create an enabling environment for technology transfer and raise the revenue needed to finance public investments. Finally, not all technologies benefit developing countries, and addressing technology mismatches should be at the center of global innovation policy, particularly when it comes to tackling climate change. So based on our new analysis, our chapter outlines 4 policy recommendations. First, countries should avoid targeting specific sectors unless social gains are clear and the capacity to administer such policies is strong. Instead, countries at the technology frontier should focus on promoting innovation more broadly by increasing public investment in fundamental research and incentivizing R&D across firms. Countries below the frontier should focus on technology adoption by investing in strategic infrastructure as well as human and digital capital. For all countries, closer international cooperation and greater exchange of knowledge instead of inward-looking industrial policies are critical to accelerate the green and digital transformation for a more prosperous future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was very, very efficient. And I think communicated the great substance of this research. We'll now hear from some comments. And why don't we turn to Dr. Criscuolo for reactions to the presentation and also reactions to anything in the chapter that wasn't covered in the presentation.
Thank you so much, Michael. I hope you can see my screen. Let me thank you for inviting me to discuss this great chapter. I think it was extremely timely, and this is sort of greatly appreciated. And I think it's timely for several reasons. And both Daniel and Li, I think, mentioned some of the more salient points. First of all, we are really in a phase of slowdown in productivity growth now. This has gone on for several decades. And we also see large and continuing cross-country gaps in technology development and in growth across countries, but let me also say increased divergence within countries, which I was very pleased to see tackled in the chapter. Third, there is more and more evidence that innovation is costlier to produce, and the rate of innovation, especially when we think about green innovation, which we need to tackle climate change, is actually slowing down. Fourth, we also see a change in business dynamics, and in particular, I would say a decline or a worsening of the state of competition and an increasing concentration and markup, which might be concerning, especially when we discuss issues related to industrial policy and the sort of political connectedness of firms. And let me also say, because of the societal challenges that we have to face, climate change being one, but also inequality and the pace and direction of the digital transformation. The focus of government is now going beyond growth and competitiveness and really focusing on issues related to sustainability, to resilience. I mean, in Europe, there is a lot of talk about open strategic autonomy, as it is called, but also, and you know, we see it in you know, the US policy arena, national security, good jobs, and tackling inequality. So this has really led to a resurgence of industrial policy. And you know, I think the chapter does a great job in trying to really focus on tackling key points that Daniel mentioned. You know, innovation at the frontier, diffusion, and let me stress again, this is very important because it looks across countries, but also within countries. The role of industrial policy for directing green technologies to achieve climate neutrality by 2050, which I'm going to get back to in a minute, but also, you know, partly, I think in the chapter, an important issue about harnessing the potential of digital technologies and the importance of digital skills was touched upon. Just to say, I really like the chapter. Some of my comments will just be about what I would have liked to see more, which means I really like the chapter. But just to say, this is one topic that was touched upon. So let me tell you what I really liked. First of all, it was extremely comprehensive and a rich analysis that, as I said, goes from across countries to a within country perspective with a very strong modeling model underpinning the analysis. I also like the fact that there was, I think, a quite fair and balanced discussion on the role of government for directing technological change. And that, I think, especially nowadays, if we want to support different economies in achieving climate neutrality, is an important discussion to have. And I think we discussed this with Michael just before starting. What I really liked, that there was discussion about pushing the frontier, sort of discussing innovation at the frontier, but also pushing and supporting diffusion across and within countries. And I will get to something that I would have liked to see discussed more, this idea of technology mismatch that Li mentioned at the end. One important point that, again, I think it's not heard enough, and the chapter does a good job mentioning, is the discussion of cost and benefit, but also stressing the differences and the potential trade-off and political challenges between the short-term cost and the long-term benefit. And I think when we discuss about policies to support innovation, the long-term benefits of innovation are particularly key when we discuss about, you know, does a policy work, is a policy beneficial? The chapter also doesn't shy away from discussing the risk of capture. And as I said, this is particularly important in a world where concentration is increasing and the potential link between market power and political power, and also the implementation challenges. And you know, there is a growing literature on the what some of Mazzucato and co-author call dynamic capabilities in government. And I'll get back to this in a minute. Design features are particularly important. We did a lot of work on R&D tax credit at UCD that I'm going to rely upon in the discussion. And last but not least, there is a mention in the paper in few places about the importance of coherent policy packages. This is something that in the work that I have done at the UCD, we have stressed a lot. So when we think that government implement policies for innovation, they don't come in a vacuum. They come within, you know, larger industrial strategies, and it is important to maintain coherence between the industrial policies that are directed at innovation and, you know, other externalities, for example, the green one. So carbon pricing, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, the role of green infrastructure, for example, a charging station for electric vehicles, and so on. And, you know, the paper also does a nice job in focusing on the role of tax policies and global tax cooperation, which for anyone who knows about UCD, this has been a really I would say, one area where the OECD has really pushed forward the global policy discussion. And this is really not a criticism, is more where I would have liked to see more, and I hope there will be a sort of volume 2 of the saga here. And one area where I think more could have been said is about the importance of openness. And I think when we discuss about industrial policy, we discuss a lot about tit for tat and so on, but I think there might be a virtuous circle, especially when we think about industrial policy for innovation. So this is where the discussion in Europe about strategic, open strategic autonomy comes in. You need to have market size to really benefit from innovation. So having this sort of link between large market size, openness, mobility, and I will get back to this, mobility of people, of goods and services, it's particularly important. And you can have both at the same time. So innovation policies do not come necessarily with conditions that stop trade. So I would have liked to see this stressed more. Similarly, the paper does a nice job in mentioning complementary asset in terms of education. I would say digital skills. I think more could have been said about long life learning and training, and how to sort of push, not only individual but also firms to invest more in this type of long life learning and support workers to face this transition. And different governments have different industrial policy in place on this. And again, one point here on openness, which I think is particularly important nowadays. There is a lot of literature when we look up at innovation. For example, Bill Kerr has a book on this, but several papers on the importance of migration, potential or of diaspora. Final point that again is made, but more could have been done on the complementarity of industrial and competition policies. And I think the paper of Acemoglu and co-author that was published in the AER in 2018 really stresses the fact that to really achieve efficiency of the policy and the full benefit from innovation policies, you need to have reallocation policies in place. Finally, policy coordination is important, and the role of institutions such as the European Union that support innovation but support basic research, which is very much stressed in the paper, and mobility of talent could have been mentioned. And on this, I would say one other thing that many governments struggle with is how to link basic research in academia with the industry, and that is something that would have been perhaps put on the table in the paper. Finally, let me say one thing that perhaps didn't transpire as much, but I think there is a fundamental trade-off between simplicity and ensuring uptake also from, for example, small and young firms, and the cost of a policy. And one such an example is the R&D tax credit, where refundability provisions are particularly important to make it effective, especially for firms in profit loss position. And the use of volume base, which means is much simpler for example, a small firm or a startup that doesn't have sort of professional accountants vis-a-vis incremental measures. Obviously, this is going to be more costly, but it might be more effective. Similarly, let me say one thing that I would have liked to see mentioned more, especially when we think about innovation policy, where there is a lot of uncertainty already, is the importance of predictability of policy. So the paper does a nice job of mentioning the importance of communication. I think importance of predictability of innovation policy and stability of the policies is much more important. I don't want to go too long, but I think perhaps the paper could have done more on discussing the role of design and the role of coherence to really crowd in private investment vis-a-vis crowding out. So the whole discussion on additionality would have been perhaps a nice addition to the chapter. And you mentioned technology mismatch. I was left wondering what it is that a country can do to really what could countries, I would say, perhaps together do to solve technology mismatches and what to do next. One thing, let me also say, the paper mentions, for example, patent boxes without a nexus requirement. As an example, I would say, of ineffective policy. Perhaps I would have liked to see a bit more on what should the government do. What is it a no-go area? Let's talk about what is a bad industrial policy. And I think, the patent boxes could have been a good example to discuss a bit more also in terms of, why is the rationale not, why is it not a good policy to go to, especially also in terms of tax competition. And on this, you use Minitel in one of your boxes, I think, as a failure. I am not too sure that was the best example I would have chosen. I think coming from France, let me say that France considers Minitel even a commercial success because it brought a lot of funds, but yeah, just an anecdote here. Let me go very quickly on R&D tax credit. We did a lot of work at the OECD, and I want to mention this for two reasons. You didn't bring any evidence on the complementarity, I would say, between R&D tax credit, which is much more of a market-based instrument, with grants, which I agree with you, and we have evidence of these, are much more effective when you want to direct innovation and want to focus on more basic research. We did a lot of work on this at the OECD, and we do find that tax credits and grants are not substitutes, but are actually complementary measure. And we also find, exactly as you suggest in your paper, that R&D tax support is much more effective on the development angle than on the basic research, and you should use grants. And one other point on this, design matters a lot, as you suggest, and we have some evidence on the effectiveness, especially if you have refundability in place. And then one thing that you do not mention in the paper, and I think it's because it's much more of a macro paper, but is the importance of heterogeneity. So R&D tax incentives, the additionality, you really see it amongst the SME, you see it much less with the large firms, which then obviously impacts the aggregate effect of the policy. On green, this is somewhere where probably I would really like to see a chapter 2bis, or volume 2 of the Fiscal Monitor, because I think there isn't a lot of discussion on, again, I wouldn't call it a trade-off, but a choice between focusing on the R&D and demonstration phase of innovation and perhaps pre-adoption versus adoption phase. And what we see in some analysis that colleagues at the OECD have done is that when we look at one measures one moment where I think support of clean technology has been quite large and generous, which is in the COVID recovery packages and measures like IRA, where we have about globally $20 trillion US dollars being spent to address climate change and innovation. We see that the focus has been much more on diffusion rather than the sort of more basic research and development phase. While we see that in terms of long-term effect, cumulative effect on cumulative emission reduction, we see that $1 spent on the research, development, and demonstration phase is going to be much more effective. So this is one area where the chapter does not really spend any time on, and I think it's an important one. And similarly, the paper does a nice job on thinking across sectors. And again, this is where governments seem to have chosen energy, transport, and building. This is where most of the recovery packages are sort of addressing their support. Much less is going to industry, that actually represents about almost a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. So again, there might be a mismatch here between where the support is going and where the emissions are coming from. So just to say, this is one area where things don't seem to go in the direction that we would like to see. Finally, let me mention one possible exemption for my hope second volume on this. You nicely rely on the model of Liu and Ma Perhaps a possible exemption could be based on the new work by Acemoglu and co-author that sort of looked not only at the role of complementary innovation in upstream sectors, but they also look at the variance in the innovation performance across sectors, where they look at the potential role of bottlenecks in the input-output sort of chain of production and knowledge network. So this, in case, I think, could be a nice area where I think is still very much an explore in terms of, how much do you want to have balanced growth across the economy versus an imbalanced one. Second extension that I would like to see is perhaps a stronger focus and on the quality and the direction of innovation. So what, and this is the point I was trying to mention on RD versus RD&D versus diffusion, perhaps relative to how much, but also breakthrough versus incremental innovation. And then secondly, on the distribution of innovation, and this is the point I was making, for example, on SME versus large firms, startup versus incumbent. This is something that would be interesting to explore because I think it has important consequences in the long run. The final area, and then after this I finished, one area where I think more should be done, and not only in this chapter, but I think more generally, a discussion of good governance of industrial policy, and in particular, we always as economists discuss about the importance of policy evaluation, and this is something that was not included, but and how these policy evaluation are used in the policy cycle, in particular, how to take into account bad policies results and include it in sunset clauses to really keep industrial policy efficient and money well spent. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I had a similar reaction, I think, Chiara, to yours when I was reading the chapter, which is that it prompted a lot of thoughts about things that I'd like to see more of and dig more into. And so I'd just like to exercise moderator's prerogative and quickly endorse your call for a volume 2. But let me turn it over to Dr. Juhasz to offer her commentary on the chapter as well.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss this chapter. First of all, I'm also really glad that the Fiscal Monitor has kind of dedicated an entire chapter to discussing this timely topic. One thing that I think the report does really well is to take this kind of big topic of industrial policy and narrow down its focus on sort of a couple of well-identifiable questions. So the report focuses on innovation policy. It asks questions about when targeted innovation as opposed to more horizontal innovation policy could be beneficial. And being the Fiscal Monitor, it of course is thinking about fiscal instruments. So what I want to do in my discussion today is really sort of just zoom out for a moment and give kind of us all and perhaps the audience in particular kind of a more big picture view of what industrial policy is. And then my remarks will be about the report, will be sort of trying to think about where sort of this bigger idea of industrial policy that we have and what we know from sort of other strands of research can kind of complement the findings of this report. So let me sort of talk a little bit about what industrial policy is. I think it's helpful to start with a definition, and the definition that Nathan Lane with co-authors and I have used in some of our work is to define industrial policy as sort of targeted government intervention trying to change the composition of economic activity in the service of some long-run public goal. So this is really sort of the policymaker, the government using its policy levers to try to enact change in what is produced domestically, in the structure of what is produced domestically, in order to achieve some public goal. So traditionally, we've thought of industrial policy, hence the name, as being government efforts to kickstart industrialization. So traditionally, this has been the government using its policy tools to try to move the economy out of agriculture into manufacturing. More timely example for particularly for advanced economies would be sort of using industrial policy to try to facilitate the net zero transition. Again, this is about policy levers. This is about the government using its policy levers to change relative prices in the economy in a way that will make sort of clean energy sources more attractive to businesses than fossil fuel based energy sources. Okay, and again, here I want to say that there's something about the government having sort of a strategic long run vision for the economy. So where this paper fits in is, of course, to think about innovation policy as having this kind of targeted mandate. So again, the type of industrial policy that the authors are considering here is going to be a subset of industrial policy, precisely because the government is trying to direct that innovation effort into some activities as opposed to others. Here I want to flag, and I think this is where some of my comments, where my first comment is going to be directed, that of course this definition of industrial policy is not defined by the type of instrument. So of course, fiscal policies, the type of fiscal policies that the authors consider are going to be industrial policies, but many other things that are not fiscal policies, that are not fiscal levers, are also going to be industrial policy. So let me now turn to, I have sort of 4 specific comments about the report itself. I think kind of by definition, the report is going to focus on fiscal instruments, and I think that's right. Where I want to sort of shade things a little bit, or sort of potentially complement things, is precisely back to this comment that I made, that industrial policy is not defined by instruments, and so I encourage kind of the audience and policymakers to always consider sort of the non-fiscal options that are on the table. And I mention this for a couple of reasons. We know, and I think this is kind of intuitive, that other instruments may be far less sensitive to capture. So if subsidies aren't on the table, then the government sitting down with certain private sector stakeholders that it is trying to partner with, this type of collaboration, once subsidies are off the table, once sort of monetary transfers from the government to the private sector are off the table, this is going to be far less sensitive to political capture. This is not sort of a hypothetical that I'm talking about, a very sort of textbook example of this type of intervention were the so-called productivity roundtables in Peru. This is, of course, something we would think of as sort of a lower capacity environment. Part of the announced policy was there's going to be no government handouts here. There's going to be no subsidies, and by all accounts, this was this achieved a lot of success, because what ended up happening was the private sector told the government what the distinct bottlenecks were that they were facing, that the government action could then sort of solve and intervene in. This is very much the government coming in and doing industrial policy by providing sort of customized public inputs, by coordinating across different agencies, but it is not the type of industrial policy that I think we're necessarily always used to thinking of. Another example here that I want to highlight is sort of Tim Bartik's work, who's also looked at sort of place-based policy in the US. And there as well, the finding seems to be that when the government is providing, when states are sort of providing subsidies to attract firms in again, various financial and fiscal instruments to attract firms, that is extremely expensive. It is creating jobs at a very, very high cost, and a much more efficient way of enacting both job creation, but potentially also productivity enhancing policies are the provision, again, of these customized public inputs. So here as well, it seems that the provision of these types of, again, non-fiscal instruments are potentially more effective at achieving similar goals. Of course, there's no, this is not to say that fiscal instruments don't have their own place in the policymakers' toolkit, but of course, you all are working within the constraints of the Fiscal Monitor, which is perfectly fine, and I don't think this is sort of a criticism of what the report did, but of course, when the policymaker is considering all the instruments at their disposal, one thing that I want to flag is that these non-fiscal instruments can be very attractive. They can work in low capacity environments. They require less implementation capacity, and they can achieve positive change. The second comment that I want to make is going to a little bit be of the same spirit. So something that I think Daniel referred to in his opening remarks, and that comes across very prominently also in the chapter itself, is that the success of industrial policy, in the author's view, is contingent on sort of the government's ability to be able to identify where the market failures are. And of course, this is sort of, I think, the traditional sort of idea that we have of industrial policy. One of the implementation challenges is, it's all good and well for us to write down a nice stylized model in which the market failures pop out of our equations, but it's an entirely different question whether the policymaker can actually identify these in reality. So I think this is kind of the traditional top-down view of the government conducting industrial policy by sort of picking activities to prioritize. I think there's sort of a different view that has emerged in parts of the social sciences and has been adopted to some extent in economics over recent decades. It sort of was seeded by the sociologist Peter Evans' seminal work, Embedded Autonomy. And the idea here, and I think this again describes a lot of what actually happens in reality, the idea here is the government actually doesn't need to know everything about market failures. It doesn't need to be able to identify these market failures. This knowledge, as the Hayekian criticism posits, this knowledge is sort of diffused in the economy. But of course, if the state is sort of densely embedded in the private sector, if it has connections to the private sector, if it can elicit this type of knowledge from the private sector, it can, as opposed to working top down, work in collaboration with the private sector as an iterative sort of back and forth with the private sector to solve and to identify where the market is not working as well as it could, and to partner with the market in making it work better. The third point that I want to make is, I think, a little bit related to Chiara's point about virtuous cycles. When I was reading sort of the section about the implementation of the Liu and Ma model, one thing I was thinking about with spillovers is that, of course, doing makes sense when we're evaluating national welfare, but of course, from the point of view of world welfare, these spillovers go somewhere. These are positive spillovers. For a salient example that I think is sort of very well known in this discussion is, no matter what you think about China's industrial policy, one thing that I think is sort of a point that we should put on the table is that what they've done in a lot of these new green technologies like solar and electric vehicles is that they have pushed the technology frontier. They have pushed the industry-wide cost curve down substantially, and that is a net gain for the world economy. That has positive welfare effects. Those spillover effects are positive for the world economy because now we have these technologies that are much more competitive with the traditional fossil fuel-based technologies than had this industrial policy not happened. So when we think about these spillovers, I think it's important to consider that from the point of view of the world economy, these do get captured somewhere. And then the last and final point that I want to make is a version of sort of the version of the one size doesn't fit all. I don't think, again, I don't think the report is making this mistake, but one thing that I'm increasingly aware of as I think about sort of what are the conditions necessary to put in place good industrial policy is to consider the political environment very, very seriously. So a policy that can work in one political environment, that same policy may be a spectacular disaster in a different political environment. So I think, again, the most salient example that I can give here is, you know, think about carbon pricing. As economists, we all agree that as part of sort of the US's climate policy package, carbon pricing has a place to play. It's also obvious that this is absolutely a non-starter currently politically. And so when we think about, you know, is the Inflation Reduction Act the best possible policy that could have been enacted in the US? I think it's important that we think not about, you know, what our textbook models say only. It's important that we also think about sort of what are the political realities on the ground. Even if we pass a carbon tax or a carbon pricing scheme today, the political backlash that will ensue may potentially undermine any further policies in the future. So here again, I think as your readers, as policymakers kind of read this report, the final point on which I would sort of kind of color the findings is to think very seriously about what a policy is going to do in a particular political environment. So thank you very much for the opportunity to engage in this dialogue. I think it's raised a lot of important questions, and I love that this is becoming sort of something that multilaterals like the International Monetary Fund are sort of pushing forward, and I hope to continue this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you for those thoughtful comments. We'll now turn it back over to Dr. Dabla-Norris, who, again, just to remind, is Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Division at the IMF, to respond to those comments. And then after that, we'll open it up to a broader conversation.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chiara and Reka, for very comprehensive and set of comments. These are all very well taken. I think we've benefited from both of your research. I think the chapter itself has really benefited from the really fine work that you've been doing over the years. I'm not going to go into, in the interest of time, and also because I'd like to open up the floor to I'm not going to go into all the specifics, but just to say that I think a lot of your points are really well taken. Design matters. No one size fits all. We need to think about the context. And as you, Reka, as you correctly pointed out, I mean, here we we brought a narrower prism to bear because we wanted to think about, growth, innovation. The debate on industrial policy currently is being colored by sort of, there's a clause that's always added. We're doing this in part for energy security, in part for innovation, in part for productivity. So we really wanted to shed this sort of a innovation productivity lens. We wanted to bring that to bear in the report. And we wanted to present a balanced view. We didn't want to say that this is all bad or this is all good. We wanted to sort of highlight the conditions under which it can actually bear fruit. And remember, the context is we're in a fiscally constrained world where debt levels are really high. Yes, some countries have more space to do this than others, but does it make sense in all circumstances? The answer is no. That the design really matters. How you structure this really matters. What are the type of market failures you're trying to target matters. If we're thinking about the pressing urgency of tackling climate change, and you're directing it towards tackling green innovation, which, as Chiara pointed out, has been slowing. Well, then how do you do it? Do governments have the capacity to vet projects, to allow firms to enter, but also to exit? So in other words, to recalibrate support as priorities change. You need a modicum of information about whether these things are going to actually work, whether you're actually targeting emissions or not. So I think the information set that the government has mattered, and the ability to sort of avoid political capture matters, or misallocation of resources matters in a world where productivity has already been structurally low. So I think what we wanted to really lay on the table is that design matters, capacity matters. Do you have the technical capacity to vet these projects in the first place? Not all governments, as we know, not all governments do. So we wanted to highlight sort of some of the conditions that we thought would be important to keep in mind if we are to see sort of welfare and growth productivity benefits of these policies. Now, I do want to advertise sort of a number of other papers that are coming out of the fund or have just been published. Chiara, you talked about green innovation and diffusion. There's actually a staff discussion note that came out last year by my colleagues in the research department that focuses precisely on the green side of things and how do we diffuse green technologies. There was discussion about sort of the broader social ramifications of these policies. How do we broaden the gains? In fact, Daniel, Li, and I have a forthcoming staff discussion note that looks at AI and fiscal policies, both on the social protection side. We touch upon issues of lifelong learning, education, but also taxation and competition policy. I agree that we need a more holistic approach to think about competition, tax, and other policies under the same sort of umbrella. I think this is really important. No one, as Reka, you correctly pointed out, there's no one thing that is industrial policy. What we've noticed in this recent wave, if you will, is there's a resurgence of industrial policy, heavy reliance on subsidies, but also discriminatory practices against foreign firms across the board. And we strongly believe that such kind of policies hurt global economy, hurt and actually prevent technology diffusion to countries and firms that need it. So I think there is, there is an unintended impact of these policies, and the idea is to minimize those effects. So let me stop there and thank Chiara and Reka for a very nice discussion.
Excellent, thank you. So this has been a really rich discussion, and we've really gotten into a lot of the important issues here. We have about 9 minutes left, and so I'm going to ask some questions, and let's try to maybe not treat this as a lightning round, but treat it as a quasi lightning round. So one thing that I'm hearing, and I think consistently, is that context matters for the success or failure of industrial policy. The economic context matters, the fiscal context matters, the political context matters, the context, you could think of design of a policy as a type of context. And so I think conversations about industrial policy are more helpful when they include specific examples. So I think what I would like to do is ask Daniel and Li to each give an example where they think industrial policy was done particularly well, and Chiara and Reka to give an example where they think industrial policy was done particularly poorly, maybe 45 seconds each. So let's start with Daniel.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, what we try to do in this report is to provide a framework to analyze the benefits and the costs of industrial policies. And so when you look at actual examples of industrial policies, there are many things in there, right? There are many measures, there are different goals. So we try to here focus on the innovation objectives, and then provide this framework to analyze policies without necessarily, picking examples. We do have a box in the report where we talk about examples that succeeded in transforming industries, like electric vehicles in China that was also mentioned before, or Airbus in the case of the EU. But even for those policies, sort of the net welfare gain is not absolutely clear, because these are also fiscally costly, and in some cases there are issues with cross-border spillovers. So I wouldn't like to come out and identify a specific policy that was netly beneficial.
Li?
Thanks. And then perhaps just to echo Daniel, when we go into the specifics industry in our report, again, one thing that comes up is that design matter. Even if you focus on specific industrial like the electronic vehicle in China, there are certain elements of the design that would make it more effective. And then there are certain elements of the design that will make it less effective or more costly. So that's sort of another thing we try to emphasize in our chapter.
Chiara?
Perhaps without mentioning any specific country, but I think policies that aim at attracting foreign direct investment and sort of produce what are called cathedral in the desert, because there isn't really the absorptive capacity around them and in supplying and sort of downstream industries that can really benefit, nor there are the skills. So I would classify this as a sort of failing industrial policy more generally. And there are various examples in the past, which, I mean, we don't need to go into detail. I don't want to. We name the sin, but not the sinners. They know who they are.
Okay. Reka?
Okay, it looks like I'm the only one not affiliated with multilateral, so I guess I'm more free to speak. Let's put it that way. But let me also just say something that answer a question you didn't ask. But I do want to sort of flag one thing that I think is important for the discussion, which is that for many decades, industrial policy, as your wonderful colleagues at the IMF have said, was the policy that shall not be named. So for a very long time, industrial policy was not an active field of research in economics, and I would say that for this reason, we have a much weaker body of empirical evidence of carefully evaluated episodes of policy using the frontier tools of our profession than we should. I think that is changing, partly because of work that people on this panel have done in the past and are currently undertaking. So Nathan Lane, Danny Roderick, and I have a paper coming out in the annual review, but it's been widely circulated already, called The New Economics of Industrial Policy, in which we do try to go through actually the vast majority of the literature that has emerged, I would say, in the last decade or so that evaluates these policy episodes. I will say that even for us on the paper, who are, I think, more sympathetic than the median economist to the idea that industrial policy can enact positive change, we were surprised by how many positive examples we were able to find. Let me just flag one that has been it was the topic of 2 job market papers this year. I mentioned this one on the Southern Italian place-based industrial policy push because I think this is a policy. These are the policies that have conventionally been thought of as being as not achieving much change in the South. And this is, I think, the main point I want to make is the reason that we want to do this type of research is that, of course, qualitative evidence matters, but we're all economists here. The bread and butter of what we do is policy evaluation. And what these papers have shown is that both at the local and at the aggregate level, part of this mezzogiorno policy has actually had positive effects. So you asked me for a negative example. I also have a paper coming out with Nathan Lane in which we discuss the ways in which in the 70s, Thailand tried to sort of mimic to a large extent the export-oriented industrial policy that East Asian miracle economies like Korea and Taiwan were undertaking. And it's a beautiful case study in the political constraints to implementing policy. I think sort of a recurring puzzle for economists is, if the core East Asia economies developed the secret sauce of how to do outward-oriented industrial policy relatively well, why was this not adopted more broadly? And what our Thailand case study shows is that policymakers were trying to put in place the same policies that Taiwan and Korea were doing. They were trying to devalue the exchange rate. They were trying to get rid of import substituting industrialization. But the political context in Thailand was entirely different. The entrenched interests the political economy didn't allow for the same devaluation of the exchange rate. It didn't allow for the same removal of the ISI tariffs. And so it wasn't that policymakers didn't know what to do. It was really that the political constraints tied their hands. That wasn't as lightning as I think you wanted, but
no, it was not. But I think it was very useful, and I've read the first of the 2 papers you mentioned, which I think is excellent, and very helpful. Daniel, Lee, can you let the audience know where they can find the report? I realized that I forgot to mention that in the introduction.
sure that's on the IMF site. If they type Fiscal Monitor on Google, April 2024, we have there the full report, which includes 2 chapters. One is more conjunctural, and then chapter 2 is this one on innovation.
Yeah, and just to add to what Daniel said, we also have a blog that kind of summarizes some of these, some of the main findings of the chapter. So some people may find that to be useful.
I'm gonna abuse our 11:30 stop a little bit and just ask Chiara one question. Chiara, you mentioned that the report talks a lot about what government should do and does not talk about what government shouldn't do. And Reka mentioned a few things government shouldn't do, but I wonder if you have in 45 seconds a few things that government shouldn't do to answer your own question, which I thought was important.
I mean, I guess the easy answer is they shouldn't give money just by listening to the most powerful sort of business person they talk to, and sort of, I think more generally, they should sort of really think of what works and listen perhaps more to economists, let me say this, about what works and what doesn't work. And that's something that I think because of political pressure, sometimes policymakers don't do enough. So economists do have a role to play in sort of advising government. So let me say also what they should do. Listen more to economists and less to sort of lobbyists, perhaps.
Yes, I think there'll be no disagreement about the argument.
May I have a quick two-hander, Michael, on that? Just to quickly to add to what Chiara said. I think it's really important to keep the objectives in mind. And sometimes I think those objectives get lost. The initial intentions may be good, but I think along the way, the objectives get lost. So, I think governments also really need to ensure that they have the objectives in mind when they're putting these oftentimes very costly policies in place.
Absolutely. Okay, so we are about 90 seconds over, which is close enough, I think, for research work at least. Let me thank all of the panelists. Let me again thank the IMF for doing some research on this important policy topic. This is a conversation that I think, to echo what Reka said, is in many ways kind of just beginning in seriousness, and there's a dearth of serious economics research using modern tools to really study industrial policy and to be able to inform policymakers. And I think the work that the IMF has done, Chiara and Reka, the work that you have done on this is laying a foundation that hopefully others will build on, and this conversation will continue to advance. I'm very happy that we could play a role in advancing that conversation here this morning. And so thanks to the audience for tuning in. Thanks again to the panelists, and thanks to you all for the work you're doing.